tenim una altra sessió internacional i tenim aquí a Mark Hedges, que ve d'Anglaterra, de Londres, i el que volíem és, sabeu que l'impacte de la tecnologia ens està transformant i està transformant la societat, i llavors els arxivers i arxiveres ens trobem que hem de replantejar algunes de les nostres metodologies i de vegades també les nostres habilitats, i hi ha tot un dubte de fins on hem d'arribar, si hem de treballar multidisciplinàriament, i el que us presentarà una mica, ell ve de les ciències de la informació, aquests conceptes que de vegades tenim una mica de conflicte, no? Què hem de ser, arxivers, gestors d'informació, i de vegades no ens fixem en què està fent una altra gent. Ell està en un departament de humanitats digitals, i és un altre punt de vista que voldríem sumar, sobretot perquè està treballant molt amb un grup de gent i suposo que ens parlarà una miqueta sobre una nova disciplina que és una barreja de l'arxivística i la computació, que és la Computational Archival Science, i és molt, molt, molt interessant que seguiu tota la bibliografia que està apareixent i les reflexions que estan fent arxivers i gent del món de la tecnologia, examinant una mica les teories i mètodes computacionals, com es poden adaptar a les nostres metodologies, pensant que la societat està canviant i no ens podem quedar d'esquenes al que està fent la societat. I com ja està entrant la gent, jo deixo de parlar i donem veu a Mark Hedges. Mark Hedges?
Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you for the introduction. Yes, I'm Mark Hedges. I was asked to talk about the work that various colleagues and I have been doing in what we term computational archival science. I should point out first, as I always do when I'm talking to archivists, that I'm not an archivist and I don't actually teach archival studies. I come from a sort of what they call a digital humanities perspective. Someone from the Department of Digital Humanities. So my apologies if I say anything foolish about archives. Usually one of my colleagues will jump in if I do. And given the theme of the conference, I was going to come at this from a sort of user perspective. How might we make archives, and for that matter, other cultural collections, more accessible to users, and in particular to the public through computational methods. After that, I'm also going to talk probably very briefly, because we're a bit contracted now, about some of the sort of curricular discussions we've been having in relation to this. And finally, I'll touch on ways in which you can get involved if you want to, events we're organising and other things. Is that working? Oh, yeah. Firstly, though, I want to acknowledge that it isn't all my own work, as they say, by any means. This broad programme of work is very much a group effort that's going on across several institutions and projects and indeed continents. So many of the slides and images have been adapted or incorporated from other projects and other presentations, so it's not all my own work. I'd like to acknowledge in particular my various colleagues in our informal computational and archival science group, and in particular those from the University of Maryland, the Digital Curation Innovation Centre in the USA, and also the National Archives in the UK, with whom we've been working quite a bit. So, firstly, what do we mean by this term? I've recently started to see it used more widely in things like calls for papers, not our own calls for papers, so clearly it may be catching on. I hate not being able to see what's happening. I have to look at the slides on my own computer. For several years now, there have been emerging various computational X's, as we say here, as researchers start to apply computational methods within various existing disciplines or practices. So here I just list a few examples with quotations: computational social science, computational biology, computational journalism. Indeed, before we started using the term, I mean myself, Maryland, and others were collaborating on various digital humanities initiatives that involve computational methods. So our initial definition of this was really the result of a symposium we held back in 2016. It seemed a logical parallel to these other computational X's. I'm personally not sure about the term archival science. It's sometimes called archival studies, and I noticed it in Spain or Catalonia as well. you call it archivistica or something, which is much, much easier if you ask me. You don't have to worry about the science or study or what. So, what do we mean by it? We define the concept as a transdisciplinary field, I say, concerned with the application of computational methods and resources to large-scale records and archives. And we further explain this application of applying computation in terms of these broad categories of activity: processing, analysis, storage, preservation, and access. It's all very, it's a definition produced by a committee. And with the aim of doing this with the aim of making things better, so specifically improving efficiency, productivity, and precision. It's not just doing it for fun. We want to actually improve how things work. I'd say in support of a range of archival-related activities: appraisal, arrangement, description, access decisions, and engaging and undertaking research with archival materials. This is the working definition, so we're not wedded to it, and it's reviewed every now and then, and we change it. A longer and more detailed explanation of the concept and its consequences, particularly for education, could be found in this collaboratively written book chapter, to which I've included a shameless plug. There's no link to it, though, because it's not online, unfortunately. So a group of us formed this informal working group, if you want to call it that, after this symposium. It's a loose network of people. You can see you can see me there laughing. Someone's obviously told a very amusing joke. It's a loose network of people, and since then we've organised a lot of workshops, other events. We've collaborated on refining our definition. We've co-authored publications. We've got grant funding together. We also have this portal, which is based at the University of Maryland, where all our past and upcoming activities are listed. So if you want to have a look at what we're up to, then you can look there. We also have a mailing list on Google Groups, so you can feel free to join it if you want to. Some things to note in our definition: there are two broad perspectives you might see in its scope. On one hand, there's the internal viewpoint, so from the archive's point of view, that is, for the work of the archivists and the other archive staff who are concerned with, broadly speaking, managing materials. But then there's also the external viewpoint of the users, the people that want to use stuff that's in archives. For example, researchers, which can be academic researchers, but also members of the broader public. They're more concerned with being able to find and access and use materials that are relevant for whatever it is they want to do. And of course, these things overlap as part of the archive's work involves organising, presenting these materials in such a way as to make them easier to find and to use. At least we hope so. And today I'm very focused really on more of the relevance of computational methods, this latter, more user-focused or public aspect of collections rather than the more archival type activities. So before I move on, I just wanted to touch on what we actually mean when we talk about computational methods and resources. It sounds very, very vague, or very general rather. It includes all sorts of methods that fall under various umbrella terms such as big data, data science, data analytics, artificial intelligence, and so on. But we're not really focused on any specific digital methods. We're taking a broad view. I mean, new technologies come and go all the time. Instead, we're concerned more with the general principles and methodological questions as to how they can be used. We'll see some examples in a moment. So this question, what mental model does a user have of an archive? It's not a particularly nice diagram. You can see what diagrams I cobbled together myself from the internet. Always look a bit flaky. By user, by the way, I apologise to use the word user. It's a bit of a computing overtones, but I can't think of a better one. So we ask ourselves the question, when people visit an archive and they use the materials in it, how do they think of these materials? What sort of mental model, if you like, do they have of the archive? Now, some researchers who are used to archives, no doubt, do have an understanding of how archives are structured, but some research that's been ongoing at our National Archives and the UK National Archives on the user's mental models, if you want to call it that, of the archive, suggests that many users don't really have a mental model of the archive at all, in the sense that they don't think in terms of the archive, they don't think in terms of archival structure. And for example, if they're accessing the information online, they may not even be aware they're interacting with an archive in the formal sense at all. Now, one immediate response to that might be, well, let's educate these people so that they know what archives are and how they're organized. And that's all, I agree, that's all a good idea. But it also raises some bigger questions, like how much are these institutional distinctions really important to everyone that uses an archive? Do users need to know that the information they're accessing is in a particular archival structure? Or should archives be thinking more flexibly about how to provide services to these users again? Many users don't think in terms of series, record, and those sort of terminologies. They think in terms of subject. They're driven by searching for information around a topic. Traditional archival classifications and structure may not really help a lot of users to find information. Indeed, they may obscure things for some people. So can we use computational methods to provide other pathways to users through these materials, pathways that are more focused on user-focused, if you want to call it that? So if someone's looking for material about a particular person or subject, for example, they most likely don't care what collection it's in. They don't care if it's in a different institution or even in another country. So I should emphasize here for a moment that these sort of pathways would be overlaid on existing structures. They're not intended to act as any sort of replacement. Thus, archival hierarchies might be one particular pathway through the network of collections, but not the only one. So one of many ways of exploring that may suit different types of people. So coming back to the public, I mean, the public are key stakeholders in archives. They're in many cases what the records in the archives are about, and they're the people who affected by the decisions and processes that archives document. And we might argue that it's imperative to try and expose this documentation in ways that increase the transparency of the decisions and processes that are documented, and consequently the public's understanding of them. At the same time, by making them more accessible to the public, it would increase inclusivity and reduce this sort of informational divide, if you want to call it that, between people with the expertise and resources to negotiate archives and those without such expertise. Let's check. So one particular line of work we've been looking at is the use of computational methods for what we call contextualization of digital records, by which we mean helping them to be understood in the context in which they were created and in which they continue to be used. So the context of a record is key for understanding its value as historical evidence, and the ability to map out and provide access to that context is important for conferring value on these records, which might otherwise be relatively disconnected pieces of information. By providing this context, we may enable them to be used more effectively, found and understood and repurposed by people who want to draw on the archives and knowledge base for an evidence base for whatever purpose that might be. So this slide here, which is actually from the UK National Archives, illustrates some ways in which these records might be usefully contextualized using computational methods. So, for example, enriching descriptions, so you can extract key information from documents, segment a document in terms of events and key changes that might happen. Collecting more detailed metadata, so the amount of metadata that the collections have can sometimes very detailed, sometimes it's much more sparse. It can be, using computational methods can be a way of increasing that. We'll see some examples in a moment. I mentioned that people often, obviously, of course, are looking by subject or topic or whatever. So one key thing might be to facilitate through computational methods, clustering by topic, so linking different across collections in relation to a particular topic, tagging things with particular topics and so on, and also providing those representations for interacting with these clusters and these networks. Joining up similar records, so these may be duplicates, they may be just records that are connected in some way. Provenance, linking collections, and so on. I won't go into all those details. But While the digital parts of archives still consist largely of digitized materials, increasingly we find the born digital nature of a lot of the records archives are collecting, at least for larger archives such as the TNA, but probably a lot of smaller ones too. The growth in the size of the collections they're getting hold of. I mean, the potential for this sort of automation is significant, but also indeed it becomes a necessity to some extent because of the increasing data size and the challenges this raises. There are some general considerations. Let's just look at a few examples. Instead of trying for completeness, which would be impossible, I'm just going to look at a few these are graph-based technologies for accessing and interacting with archival content. So we often see that, I mean, the people that occur in archival documents are often a key point of reference for access. So we can begin by looking at networks of people as a starting point. Now, this is a completely fictional example, which I like to put in. It's actually based on characters from Games of Thrones, which I believe is a TV series, which I've never watched, actually. But there's lots of characters in it. And judging by the people I know, I'm probably one of the few people who's never seen a single episode. But despite being fictional, I think it does clarify why graph-based representations can make great sense for data about people, much more than, say, some sort of tabular representation or traditional finding aid. Or at least it offers certain advantages, even if it doesn't necessarily constitute a replacement. It adds features which wouldn't otherwise be available. And this isn't just because you can see things more intuitively, as here. It may not be all the case anyway, as graphs get very crowded. But the key thing to notice is that one key thing to note is that once information is represented in this form, you can start to use various sort of analysis methods and algorithms that have been developed, mostly in contexts other than the humanities, for analyzing these structures and these connections. There's a lot of work being done on this in other disciplines, for analyzing the interactions between individuals or groups. Most of these methods, a lot of them started in the social sciences. There's also, of course, an increasing amount of work in industry, fueled by the rise of social media and other forms of online data capture, and consequently availability of big graph data sets for other commercial purposes. So this has led to quite a rise in tools being developed. By the way, I should add, when I speak of graph here, I mean these sort of network structures with sort of nodes and links between them. The nodes here correspond to people and links between the relationships between people, but this need not always be the case. There can be other things other than people. Just a quick technical aside. I don't want to be very technical here, but I just wanted to emphasize a little the difference between relational databases and graph databases, which are databases specifically designed to manage graph data. Instead of just sort of tables in which you have predefined schemas, I'm sure a lot of you encountered standard databases, a bit like sort of spreadsheets almost, but a bit more structured, with specific data types. In these, you can have relationships. They tend to be implicit. Graph databases, on the other hand, are typically said to be schema-less, so that means you can put all sorts of information in. You can add additional information as you go along. But also it represents these relationships as things in themselves, so you can give them properties and tag them and so forth, and new types of relationship can be added. So it's much more flexible type of software for managing this sort of information. And a lot of the things we'll see in a moment, we're using this graph sort of database technology. Oops, sorry, I should have been showing that graph, that slide when I was doing that last little talk. I clicked it here, but not on the main screen. I do apologize. I won't do that again. Given that we've expressed our information in the graph, what sort of things can you compute from it, so to speak? This can get highly mathematical, but this probably gives you some ideas. You can look at ways of calculating centrality of a node in the graph. You look at ways of calculating how how influential a node is. You can identify individuals who are very connected, others who are more fringe figures in the network. You can cluster the data, so you can look at groups that are closely interconnected together, but with maybe limited connections outside the group, so little cliques who work together, and people who form bridges between clusters. This may seem a bit contrived, but such roles can be very important in a historical context. So, for example, someone who's a bridge between clusters might represent someone who enables different factions of a political movement to stay together rather than splintering apart. I won't say too much about that. I'll just say that, interpretation is always needed in these analyses. You just can't treat the numbers in a naive way. I'm just going to do some more pretty examples now. Here's another real example, although the article I've taken it from is rather light-hearted. Essentially, this graph incorporates information on relationships between people extracted from various archival sources from the time of the American War of Independence. So the results of the underlying calculations have been represented visually to help you see what's going on. And the graph has been clustered by connectedness, so essentially more mutually interconnected people form these visible groups or clusters, and there are peripheral individuals who are only weakly connected to the others. There are several individuals that connect clusters. The most important of these, as far as the numbers are concerned, turns out to be Paul Revere, who was very famous in the American Revolution. I'm not sufficiently knowledgeable about the War of Independence to say what this signifies, but I guess it signifies something, and if you were interested in reading an accessible but still serious account of this, then this is quite a nice article, I think. Right, well, I've strayed away from archives a bit, so let's move back. Archives, of course, naturally have a graph structure. This sort of traditional archive structure is a tree, which is a type of graph. But once you look at the nature of the records within these collections, more complex graphs can emerge. So there may be, as I said, links across collections. A collection may at some point have been split up, for example, or different collections may simply contain materials that are related in some way. I'll look at some examples of this just in a moment. Again, I said, I've emphasized that these sort of representations aren't a matter of either or. You can have both. This is a particular example from some work King's was doing with some other people. It's an EU project. It's from the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, which, among other things, is looking at Holocaust-related archives. The records in these archives can have a very complex history. They're often split up, and in many cases, there are multiple carbon copies, if you can remember what a carbon copy is, of what is essentially the same document scattered across different archives. This graph here represents, it's just a snapshot from a sort of a bigger interface taken for illustration. It represents links between multiple copies and descriptions of the same material in an attempt to sort of construct a graph linking records that are dispersed but are related in terms of their provenance in the archival sense. And actually all this was based on links that could be identified from looking at the various catalogues and finding aids. They didn't even look at the documents themselves, I don't think. I believe. In short, this has been used to create what you might think of as virtual collections, which reunite dispersed collections in a virtual space. So this is clearly of great importance for researchers and also for the relatives and descendants of Holocaust victims and survivors. Much of this information was previously very hard to get hold of because the archives could be quite small and maybe less known about. As well as this, it also supports annotation, by which I mean that researchers can add additional information and metadata and links and so forth, and thus enriching collections. And it also supports a clear way of indicating what provenance is, both of individual records, which archive does this come from? Is it the carbon copy of something from elsewhere? And also the provenance of information about the material, which can be insertions made by who asserts what, so you can distinguish between the curatorial decisions of archivists and the annotations of researchers. So it's clear who's made a particular decision, and one might then draw conclusions about its consequences. So this, if you think back to that slide on contextualization with the 6 blocks I had a few slides ago, this addresses several of, at least, of those types of contextualization. Here's another example. How am I doing? Yeah, sorry. Okay, here's another example. This time's from the UK National Archives. This was created by experimenting with more statistical algorithms for probabilistic linking of records with the aim of creating new routes for navigating across these collections and by linking people, places, and other entities. These links were identified, and are not presented as curated assertions of authoritative truth. They're presented rather as expressions of confidence in the statistical likelihood of connection between different people. So here, for example, we have two names that are very similar but not identical. Are they the same person? Well, I don't know. I don't think they knew either. The confidence you might have in that depends on various factors. How similar are the names? How unusual is the name? What are the dates of the documents? Are there address information and so forth? So this name was someone called Boulonnois, which is quite rare in England anyway. It's maybe less rare in some places. But you can see the names aren't quite the same, but that could easily be due to error. Instead of trying to cleanse and standardize this data and impose some order on it, sorry. I must stop. I'll tell you what, I'll lean over and look at the screen. That way I won't do that again. Okay.
But you have to put
Yeah, I'll have to do that again. I'll push that away. I'll just look at the screen. I do apologize about that again. Yeah, this example, as I said, you can see here two records mentioning this person, Percy Boulonnois, which the name is slightly different. Are they the same? Well, instead of trying to cleanse and sort of standardize the data or impose some order where which isn't there in the first place, this experiment tried to preserve the uncertainty and nuances that are present in the original document and embrace the fuzziness, if you like, and produce these sort of links which are probabilistic or statistical in nature, rather than saying, yes, this is definitely the same person. And using probabilities in this way opens new access routes for heritage collections. So instead of a static collection of documents, we have, this extensible network of people and places and events which are connected by by context. And I emphasize again, this is a matter of alternative ways into the material rather than completely new ones. I'll do a third example, which is from our colleagues in Maryland. I think it illustrates similar things in possibly a different way. This is during World War II. Many Japanese and Japanese Americans in the US were sort of interned in relocation camps, they were called. And this project involved the paper records relating to these camps, all of which are held at the National Archives and Records Administration in Washington, D.C. Although due to privacy restrictions, they're not generally accessible to the public. This is because, for example, you have information about people who may have been children at the time, and there are complex privacy laws that they have to naturally conform to. The records comprised paper index cards, records of what they called internal security cases, which means people broke the rules of the camp. So what did my colleagues in Maryland do? They especially used computational linguistics methods to extract metadata from the index cards so that, well, firstly, the archivists at NARA would have the information they need to determine appropriate access restrictions. So as I said, not all of them need to be private. It's a matter of determining which ones do and which ones don't. So this process would enable the resource to be made more open. And of course, this material is of very great interest to the descendants of those people who are interned. Indeed, my Maryland colleagues are actually working with a community organization of such descendants. So you can see the sort of human rights connections here. Possibly more connected with my previous examples. They're producing these digital surrogates, both from the text, both to add value to the archive, providing detailed metadata, which is currently conspicuous maybe by its absence, but to also apply these sort of graph analytics and also geospatial techniques to provide more insightful ways of accessing the materials, as in these two examples. That's the end of this set of examples anyway. I hope I wasn't too confusing leaping across topics. I wanted to get across was the potential for using computational methods, and in particular graph-based ones, to help people carry out research using archives, but also as a way of providing interfaces that allow people to explore information links by sort of following the graph rather than having to deal with finding aids, which are fine. I don't say anything against them, but it's perhaps an alternative way of finding their way into the information. Now, I realise we're getting a bit short on time, so I'm going to skip over some slides. I'm just going to give some examples of These aren't from an archive, they were just sort of examples of natural language processing, but you can have a look at the slide. I think the slides will be put up, will they? The slides will be on the website. Yeah, so if you want to look at these, you can look at them separately. I've only got 5 more minutes, so I thought I'd skip through. 5 more minutes? 5 minutes, okay. So I'll skip through to that's another example. I was going to talk about the educational aspects a bit, but I'll probably skip over those. Again, there's, I hate animations. Go on, get on with it. Okay, that's the end of the animations. Again, if anyone wants to, there's information about this on the slides beyond the web, and also if you look on our portal that's at the University of Maryland website, then you find all sorts of information about these sort of things. You can always drop me an email if you want to. So really, I just wanted to talk now about opportunities for collaboration. So finally, our group, if you want to on computational archival science, is really a collaborative network. We're quite informal, and we're very happy if other people want to join in. So I wanted to round off the talk with something about future collaboration possibilities. We organise quite a lot of events, sometimes at conferences and sometimes elsewhere. Past events, and future ones are listed on the portal. I just wanted to list a few upcoming ones. Upcoming in the next 12 months. There's the annual conference on the Archival Education and Research Institute. This is an organisation that aims to promote research in archival studies, broadly conceived, and curricular innovations in archival education. It's going to be in Liverpool, in England, in July, and we're doing a panel on developing a computational curriculum framework for archival education. So really that's just going to be on precisely the topic that I had to skip over for shortage of time. About a month later, we got another panel along similar lines, although maybe a bit more general, looking at sort of digital skills in archives at the Archives and Records Association. That's essentially the UK and Ireland equivalent of the organisation that invited me here. That's in Leeds, in England as well. In December, we're organising what's now our 4th annual workshop on computational archival science at the IEEE Big Data Conference, which sounds very frightening, which takes place this year in Los Angeles in December. So we strongly advise, if anyone whose work might be relevant to this, to consider submitting a paper. The call isn't actually out yet, but it'll be on this aforementioned portal. I should add this conference is actually quite a frighteningly computer science conference. I've tried going to some of the other sessions, and I've been a bit lost, to be honest. Ours is really the sort of the humanistic, the token humanistic workshop at the conference, but it always seems to be very well attended. Okay, that's one. This is a particular project we've just been funded for by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK, but it's an international one with us, Maryland, the National Archives, and the Maryland State Archives. The idea of this is to explore a bit more systematically this idea of context in archives and using computational approaches to find or explore, to extract, to do contextualization. The research is taking place in a series of sort of data challenge events we're running, in which we get transdisciplinary teams together, including archival experts, together with data and computer scientists, and what we think of as digitally aware humanists, so people who might want to do research in archives that have some understanding of digital matters, to address a range of sort of archival challenges which will be defined by the archive in question. It's not focused on specific technologies, but rather we're going to be examining a range of technologies and methods from sort of data science with the aim of elucidating their relevance for archival practice and hopefully developing more practical methodology for implementing these sort of approaches within archives. We'll also identify sort of research priorities for future work. I won't say too much more about that, but the 2 data challenge events, in case you're interested in following them, there's one at the UK National Archives, and there's one at the Maryland State Archives in the USA. They're both of limited attendance because we want to keep the groups very small. But if anyone's interested in attending, certainly the UK one anyway, there's a sort of call for proposals of expressions of interest, let's say, if you're interested in going. Finally, all the results from this will be presented at a symposium in London over 2 or 3 days, which we'll be holding next January. I don't know the details of that, when that will be yet. But again, if you're interested in coming along, just let me know, and the information will be published on the portal or on the website at some point. I'm probably okay. So I just briefly, I'll skip over that. Okay, I'll just mention this one thing very briefly. As part of a different project, as the Horizon 2020 project Parthenos, we're carrying out what's called a foresight study, and essentially this is investigating how sort of digital research methods and technologies and infrastructures for sort of cultural heritage and digital humanities may develop over the next 5 to 10 years. And it's not really just a matter of future gazing. We're trying to get information from all sorts of different stakeholders. It could be archivists, they could be researchers who use archives, on things they view as trends in the field or problems or things that need to be addressed. And the good thing about this is it's feeding into a report which will feed into sort of EU funders. So it's actually a way of making your feelings known. There's a sort of, well, this is a link, and you can get to a survey where you can feel free to add whatever information you want. This information will be then taken into the report and fed up to the EU, who hopefully will make funding decisions on the basis of it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this interesting and useful presentation. Creo que todos os habéis quedado un poco así con más ganas. Estaría bien montar workshops y desarrollar, porque como han dicho en otras sesiones, tenemos muchos datos y muchos datos que explotar, que tratar, pero no solo en el aspecto de dar acceso, sino también en el de tratamiento. Y creo que seguro que alguno de vosotros tendrá alguna pregunta. ¿Alguna pregunta? Any questions, please? No?
I'll be around all afternoon anyway. I'm afraid I'm going to miss the party. If I don't know there was a party, I'll
Some
stay
people
next
asked me before
Yeah.
if you can give us some examples of software for making graphs, because they want to graph all the archive.
Well, it depends. It really depends on what they're starting with. So it's probably
For the beginning.
Yeah. Well, it's something that's easy to give a simple answer to. So it's probably better if I direct them to some. I'll tell you what. I'll after the event, I shall send something around to you that you can.
Okay, and we can think of more collaborations.
Precisely, yeah. It's not sort of thing you can give a glib answer. Oh yeah, do this.
Here there are a lot of archivists with a lot of material and data in their archives, and they have to know skills and software to work with the material there. And
I think the important thing is, I think skill. I mean, I didn't really touch on skills, obviously, but that's obviously a very important thing, which is something we're touching. I mentioned those 2 panels we're doing.
Because technology is changing our lives, and we have to be there and understand how it affects to the production of documents and records.
Indeed, I think it's important for them to bring in sort of. I mean, we obviously no one expects archivists to suddenly become computing people, or necessarily to be able to write programs, or what they need to develop. I think is a more general, specific types of digital literacy or computational literacy, if you want to call it that. So that might mean having some sort of bridge builders between communities between archivists and more computer scientists. So I mentioned those workshops we're running at the National Archives, for example. That's precisely what we're trying to do. We're going to have little teams where we've got archivists with a problem that they want to solve, different data science groups, historians who might want to use archives, and then they get together and brainstorm how best to approach different problems. So that I mean, the outcomes from that would be probably very interesting to the audience, because we'll publish them all, because they'll give nice little case studies. Actually, the slide I skipped over. Hang on, can I just go backwards? This is actually at the University of Maryland, and it's really been done as part of their archives or information science master's programs. But they've got this site where they're storing little, what they call them lesson plans, But there's actually little case studies embedded in Jupyter notebooks, if you know what they are, which tend to be ways of encapsulating software and data and narrative text to make sort of executable case studies. So if you want to look at some examples, that's probably a nice place to go. I think the link's there. It's publicly available, and you can sort of, I think you can even download them and play with them yourselves. It's maybe an easy way of, because it's aimed at sort of graduate students, so it's.
Very interesting.
That'd be
¿Alguna
nice.
pregunta? ¿Us animeu? Sí, no? És que podem conversar.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Okay.
No sé si heu
You'll
sentit...
assemble them later, you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No sé si heu sentit bé a Vicenç, però Vicenç diu que... Sí, l'heu sentit bé? No, vale. Ha comentat que la sessió que ve després complementa una mica tot el que ha estat comentant ell i com tot el tema de l'avaluació i totes les els nostres processos es transformen en aquest món digital i com ens afecta. Sense més, agraïm i donem un aplaudiment a Marc i deixem la sessió.